Welcome to Arcade Audio.
Paired. Now reading. Show description for podcast Paired. Paired is a short-form comedy fiction podcast exploring guided meditations and musings from your digital assistant. Paired is a podcast that answers the question, what if Alexa weren't evil? Paired will debut its new season on September 25th, featuring guest stars such as Janet Varney, Philip Molina, Addison Peacock, Alex Flanagan, Sarah Shockey, and many more. Paired is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, and wherever else you listen to podcasts. End show description. Unpaired.
What up, Shark Tank?
To history or not to history? That is the question, Natalie. Another question is also, what's a shark tank?
I meant to say, what up, Shark Tank, and welcome to Shared History, but oops. Well, I don't know if you knew this, Cass, but as of recording, next week starts Shark Week.
Oh, does it now?
Yep, Shark Week starts on my birthday this year. Sorry, listeners, we're recording this in August.
You know, I just want to live every week like it's Shark Week.
You gotta do it. You gotta do it. Welcome to season 3 of Shared History.
I'm one of your hosts, Cass Maher.
I'm the other one, Nat Younger.
Boy, oh boy, we've got 2 seasons of history under our belt.
We do. I hope they don't run out of history.
That would not be good for us.
It wouldn't. We'd have to pivot. I'm not prepared.
You know what, Natalie? Let's make history.
Oh.
Aren't we?
Aren't we already? Just
gives us more of an excuse to talk about ourselves then.
Yeah. You may have noticed, I feel like we should address the elephant not in the room, not to call him an elephant. I know it's tough for you. We are not joined by DJ Rip. He will not be joining us this season. He's still with us. So I'm just maybe he'll pop on as a guest. But he's a very busy boy, and he's had to refocus his efforts on developing new podcasts. We always knew from the beginning that we were only going to have him for a couple of seasons.
Yeah, we want to give a shout out to DJ Rip, DJ Richard Camelucci, and Arcade Audio, because he's kind of doing a lot of the big wig work for Arcade Audio. And when he approached us about doing a podcast, did not think that he would be able to run the ones and twos for us. Yeah. So, and then when he started producing for us, he ended up becoming a part of the show, and it was, I love you, Natalie, but it was my favorite part of the show that Rip.
It was a lot of people's favorite part of the show. Could drop some beats and bops.
So yeah, so that was a lovely kind of unexpected surprise that has now come to the end of its.
Hey, if you love it, you gotta let it go.
Then hopefully Rip will come back to us.
Mm-hmm. Hopefully. Fingers crossed. We'll get him back on here for all of our DJ strippers out there.
Can we insert an audio cue of Vitamin C's graduation song right here?
Uh-huh.
As we go on.
But we can only insert us talking about it because
okay. Well then
rights.
All right.
We also would like to carry on the tradition from last season of shouting out a charity that we would love if y'all supported. Today, I'd like to shout out the American Society for Deaf Children, which is an organization that supports early language development programs, and serves as a support network for parents and families with deaf or hard of hearing children. And their website is deafchildren.org. Other than that, we'd like to encourage you to support us. Wow, that sounded...
Hard cut. Hard segue.
Yeah. But actually, one of the best ways that you guys can support us doesn't cost any dollar bills.
You can leave us a review on Apple Podcast, on Stitcher, on whatever platform you listen to podcasts that allows.
Those are the only two that let you leave reviews.
Exactly. Follow us on the socials. Leaving reviews is one of the best ways to not only make us feel good about ourselves, but also get the word out to other people about the pod.
Yeah, and maybe this season, for every new review we get, maybe we'll send like a pin or something, because we got a bunch of buttons last season with the intent being that we would give them away at live shows, and then none of us were allowed to see each other ever again.
And then fate dealt us a cruel, cruel hand.
Yeah. That would be fun.
That would be
some
fun.
Handwritten notes and some buttons.
Nat loves a good snail mail.
Oh my god, I love sending mail. All right, well, before I get carried away and have to go change my pants thinking about the U.S. Postal Service.
That should be our charity, the U.S. Postal Service.
Well, I know, right? Oh, you want to dig down into some history?
Let's historicize right now.
Let's do it. We didn't decide who was going first.
I think if we're digging into history, I think I should go first because I think my history topic wins history.
Oh, okay. I mean, that's a bold claim.
It's one might say it's a big claim, and you might have your mind blown.
Oh,
Guess what
boy.
my history topic is today?
Hang on, let me ready my body for this big claim. I'm prepared.
My topic today is deep history.
Oh. That just seems like it's the name of another podcast.
I know, right? History, by definition, is the study of the past. Historians are not so much... Well, they study history, but their main job is to form the narrative of history, right? Mm-hmm. They're storytellers. And they study history, they compile it together, and they form this kind of composite narrative for us all to pull from. Well, history and historians study human existence. More specifically, they study human history from the time that organized writing became a thing. So as soon as written language was created, that's when we start history. Everything.
When you say when you say written language, does that include I know that includes like hieroglyphs and whatnot, because that was a written language, but does that include like further back pictographs like that you would like cave drawings and stuff? Does that count?
No. So so organized language, so that's going to be like cuneiform or hieroglyphics, pictographs, not like cave drawings or anything, but like an organized writing
art as a language.
Yes. An organized writing system where there are rules, there's lexicon, there's all those things.
Okay.
Everything before written language is called prehistory. Listeners, I'm quoting my finger quote hands. I'm giving quote bunnies, air quotes. So prehistory, that time period, is from the time of stone tools, Stone Age, up until organized written language.
Okay.
So that is prehistory.
I feel like this verbiage is weird. I feel like the verbiage doesn't make sense. Yeah. That's still history, but okay.
Yes. So deep history, what that's trying to do is there's scholars. This has been around for a while.
History about the movie Into the Deep, or
Deep
Blue
Impact,
Sea, or Deep Impact, or
mm-hmm.
all of the above.
Johnny Deep. Oh no, that's Depp.
No.
Ooh, Johnny Depp.
This is not about him.
Never. It is never about him. So I'm talking at least less about the actual history, but more of the kind of the study of history. And deep history is asking to almost contextualize that just because it's not written down doesn't mean we can't have evidence of history. There's this kind of idea of no documents, no history. We talk a lot of times about primary sources, you and I, and those tend to be letters or books or whatever, something written down, something where someone is telling the story of what happened. We found that original copy.
Something often very subjective.
Exactly. And also, since it is, historians are storytellers or whatnot, that alienates a lot of aspects of prehistory or deep history. It seems like everything before written language gets into like archaeology and paleontology and so it becomes science.
When you said like that history, like they basically believe history didn't start, quote unquote, until written documents, and that anything before that isn't, quote unquote, history. I was like, I feel like Indiana Jones would have something to say about that.
Yes. So I was trying to kind of like branch out of like, oh, how can I push the bounds of history for a topic? And I was like, well, like I went to a drive-in movie. We were supposed to see Jurassic Park, but that was the main feature, so it didn't start till like 11. It was really late and we were really tired, so we ended up going home and just seeing Back to the Future. But I really wanted to see Jurassic Park on the drive-in movie theater. And then I was like, oh my God, like that's like kind of history. Could I do a dinosaur episode? And as I'm like perusing through the interwebs, I see deep history and I giggled. And then I looked into it more. And yeah, it's not that historians don't believe history existed, but the scope and the scale of what we think of as the umbrella term of history or historians, what they do, it's very limited in scope. And actually, 3 out of 4 historians specialize in the post-industrial era or the 20th century, according to the American Historical Association.
And 4 out of 5 historians recommend Crest.
And that is true. And that is science.
That is science.
But if you think about it, 75% of historians as a profession study the 20th century. Like, munch on that for a little bit.
I'm trying to like munch on like how many of our episodes have been 20th century.
Well, I think you and I kind of...
We're better than most historians. We're better than 76% of historians.
No,
cool.
I think,
Got it. Take it to the bank.
You and I are just so woke and in touch that we knew
we're
that
historically woke.
We knew, no, you and I, when we kind of were prepping the podcast, we knew that what our specific interests were. Like, I want to do Victorian poetry, British literature, like European. You want to live in, the Mediterranean Golden Age.
I do.
So we really pushed ourselves outside of that. And so I think our very first episode was the Revolutionary War. My topic was. I think you and I have actively tried to, like, I've been trying to get ancient history and like early, like, South American history that like wasn't written down, and all that stuff, because we knew we were going to.
Yeah. All of the topics last season that I found, did all of my research, and then the last page of all of my sources was like, or none of this happened. We don't know.
I knew that I was going to want to stick to like British literature in that era. So I've actively, both of us are trying to go outside of it. But if you think about where we default to, it's Les Mis and it's post-industrial, Eurocentric, maybe not American history, because you and I, everyone knows how we feel about American history, but in that sense. And so thinking about that 75% of historians, professional grade historians, only study like the literal smallest swath of history. Mm-hmm. And that not only do they emphasize that, but that the discipline is relegated to a very small portion of time. There's a great kind of YouTube web series I found that's done by John and Hank Green. John Green of The Fault in Our Stars.
Yes.
And it's called Crash Course Big History. So the term deep history talks about human history from the very beginning of advanced modern humans, so like Homo sapiens and all that stuff. Big history is this concept of history in huge scope. We're not going to break it down into like early postmodern, industrial, whatever. It's actively avoiding those like tiny little subsets and looking at bigger trends. It's starting from the Big Bang and not treating that as science, treating it as history. So deep history is the study of the distant past of human species, and it encourages scholars in anthropology, archaeology, primatology, which is the study of primates, genetics, and linguistics to work together to write a common narrative about the beginnings of humans and to redress what they see as an imbalance among historians who mostly concentrate on more recent periods. It's like this cross-disciplinary, like, in my mind, it's just contextualizing history, and not just within the form of history, but within the form of archaeology, paleontology, the material aspects of it. And it's just this kind of like, I don't know, it just seems so obvious.
Yeah.
But it's something that is so, it's not done, and people kind of push that thought away. Because
That's
when
so
you think
interesting, because like
when you think of history beyond a certain point, you just go to science, right?
yeah.
Archaeology is science.
I was also going to say, like, it's also interesting because, like, I feel like historians pull from the findings of those groups very often. It's always a big coup when an archaeologist discovers some culture, like a culturally significant site or an old body. Or when they, it's interesting because I feel like historians will say, oh, what an important day for history that this discipline found this or discovered X or put together X, Y, or Z. And they'll kind of like reference that, but it doesn't feel like those disciplines always work hand in hand. From, I would say, like, I know you said that 70+% study the 20th century. I would say like from 17th, 16th, like 15th century on, it seems like they kind of go their separate ways unless they're crossing paths to say like it was historically significant that this scientific discovery was made.
Right. Yeah. The kind of like the biggest proponent of deep history is Daniel Lord Smale. And
I'm sorry, Smale?
Smale, like snail but with an M.
Oh.
He is a professor of history at Harvard University. He's become the biggest proponent of deep history. I wrote in my notes, it says, Natalie's guy. He teaches the history of Mediterranean societies between 1100 and 1600.
Yes.
Yeah, he's a Harvard professor, and I don't know if he coined the term deep history himself, but there's a great New York Times article that kind of breaks down like what deep history is, why it's a thing, why people care about it, and what's the point. He says that heavy emphasis on very short time spans in very recent history has called a quote-unquote shallow history. And the only antidote to that is deep history. So it's less a specific era or history or proponent of history. It's almost like we're trying to reframe how we study history and how we contextualize it with each other.
Because all of those disciplines feed into each other. This is bananas to me. That
right.
This is like a unusual way or a groundbreaking way to study history.
And it is kind of like, well, and so groundbreaking, it seems like new. When in my research, like stuff like this has been around for a while, and I think in the, when was it, like the 70s and the 80s or something, people were trying to take this like big, large scale view of history and do kind of like the grand narrative of things. And the problem with it is that especially based on the quote unquote shallow history that we have, that we emphasize, that we teach in school, everything became very Eurocentric and like, this is the way it should be. Everything's building up to, look at all the great things Europeans are about to do when we study this bit of history. Or it's very Eurocentric. So deep history, it's not new, but the kind of modern take of it now is like, let's keep the scope and lose the bias.
Well, because if you go back far enough, we're all basically from Africa.
Exactly. And so that's also why I think this is so interesting and so pertinent to us, because you and I are every time we talk about a topic, we try to contextualize it, right?
Some of us better than others.
Yes. What was happening before this? What was happening at the same time in different places? Because that informs so much of why this was going on, or if it was going on, why it mattered. And so the people who are like, not anti-deep history, but kind of like, what's the fucking point? They're like, well, what does this serve? What do we need? And they keep talking about what questions are we asking and whatnot. And what evidence base you have. Like, why do we care about contextualizing this? Why do we care about going so far back? In this New York Times article, there was this great explanation using a specific example of beads, right? So, like, people were creating and using beads before written language was ever existed, right? And so by using this, beads were 43,000 years ago, there was this explosion of bead making relative to the given population, right? And they were used to extend social relationships, loyalty, status, decoration. It was a form of currency. This became essentially the precursor of mass-produced items. Like, when you think 43,000 years ago, and they look at all the evidence of beads, like, they have actual evidence that people were making beads from seashells and pearl teeth from red deer. Like, it was an active, like, people were making these en masse. They were making these for a specific purpose. So it is the beginning of mass-produced items. They made like an analogy to iPhones and whatnot. And then they started making them ornate and whatnot. And so there was this great quote that says, they are making expensive copies of inexpensive objects, a strange inversion of the pattern of luxury knockoffs. So like, wild. These beads mean nothing, but they were putting such an emphasis on it. And us, when we look back, especially our kind of context of Neanderthals or early Homo sapiens, is like, you dumbass. You put so much emphasis on you're selling beads and you're using beads to whatever. Well, beads are just coins. Beads are currency. So,
but really, they were like, hey, Chard, what kind of what's the word? What edition of hollow red deer tooth do you have?
Oh, I got a red. I got the X.
Oh man, that's so cool.
Got the iPhone X.
I had to get the last year's. My insurance plan was crap, man.
Oh man, you should have. I waited outside the bead cave for an hour in line just to get my pearl teeth red deer beads.
That's dedication, man.
Sick.
I got it.
Sick.
I'm just still on this shell bead game. I can't switch, man. I can't make the switch. I've had a shell bead my whole life.
Oh man. Damn it, I'm trying to make an analogy to like the green bubbles from Androids. But so if you look at beads as like that's human history before anything was written down. And the reason we usually start history or start the study of this era of history with language, with written language, is because they're literally telling us. If we can figure out what it is they're writing, they're literally telling us their history. Mm-hmm. It makes sense to say that if nothing was written down, we don't know what they're thinking, what they're doing.
Harder to not like fact check, because we know that a lot of like old historical sources, like parts of them need to be taken with a grain of salt. History is written by the victors, blah blah blah. But if it's written down, there's more I guess, more of a chance that there are multiple sources
Yeah.
on the same subject, or at least something that
gives
you
you
can...
a jumping off point, right?
Yeah.
The concept of deep history is, despite the lack of written records, which there's this great little snippet said, the historian's traditional sidearm, like their weapons
is a whip, right?
Oh
no,
a
sorry,
whip, it's a whip, and it's written records.
Got it. Cool.
There have been so much advances in archaeological analysis, in gene mapping, ecology, all of these, what we usually think of as like more scientific things, that we don't need language as evidence. I mean, we do. It's great. But we can go beyond that. And we can research history beyond the advent of writing. Beads is just an example.
The scientific route is is less subjective.
Absolutely. It's just like when they found that mummy with its vocal cords still intact, and then they blew air through it, and they could hear what a mummy sounds like. No, it was like a... If you guys don't know what we're talking about, there's a video. It was some I don't know, like 60-minute sciencey thing or whatever. They're like, we found a mummy. It's like larynx was intact.
We 3D printed its...
Yeah. Oh yeah, we 3D printed its larynx. We blow air through it. We can hear what a mummy sounds like. And they're showing a picture of the mummy wrapped up, and it just screams. Which is what I bet a mummy would sound like if it woke up 3,000 years later and it was a fucking mummy.
I regret to inform you that the clip that you're talking about was the doctored one.
I thought it was. I was like, there's no way it's that good.
The actual clip it's just kind of going like John Oliver referenced it in a currently recent episode, and he describes it as like basically like an old dusty orgasm, for lack of better term. And the one that you're talking about, we did reshare because somebody sent it to us, and I thought it was hilarious, and I knew it was doctored, but it's just them going or something like that.
You can tell the audio is different. You can tell it's like a cut and paste. And I thought that was the case, but I just wanted to believe it was true.
It's beautiful.
So yeah, so deep history, it's again, it's kind of meta. It's kind of like, okay, well, it's just history. It's just like the way people are talking about it or the way people think about it. It's really actually very important if we're looking at, especially Natalie, what you and I love so much is contextualizing history. If we're talking about like where things started, how they started, when we look back at something as simple as beads, it seems very trivial. It seems childlike almost. Like, okay, wow, you guys really loved beads. You loved shiny objects. But beads were political alliances, economic networks. It says, there was a quote here that says, economic networks that were enforced by the exchange of beads and their offspring, coins. Later, beads allowed ancient people to transform food surpluses created by shifts in production into commerce and political power. Credit cards, banknotes, gold coins, shell bead necklaces all share a common genealogy. You can't fully understand how money works without beads. It's such a simple thing and seems very obvious and like inconsequential, but without that basic trivial foundation, like look at how complex everything is now. Focusing on deep history takes the politics out of history. When we look at really hyper-specific eras or studies of disciplines, everything gets politicized, right? Because it's closer to us. We're able to see like, this affects me this way because of this, or it started this way, Les Mis, French Revolution, all that stuff. It's politicized. When you can break it down to, well, Chorn wanted a bead to go give to Smeagol to do the thing or whatever. Like,
it's hard to come up with prehistoric names on the spot.
It's just like Ugg and Og. But yeah, it was really fascinating to, I mean, I didn't really tell you about history, but we are...
But you did.
We are not historians. And so the study of history is just as important as the history itself. The way we're presenting it. I mean, you look at American high school textbooks and the way they approach teaching slavery and whatnot, you know, where big oof. You know, if we're not contextualizing it, if we're giving a biased version, a politicized version, if we're not talking about what happened before, I feel like when we learn about slavery or the Civil War or anything in America, we kind of talk about it in this bubble. And we don't really talk about the slave trade or, I mean, it's just very briefly touched upon, but like the economics of it and the reason why it stayed in power for so long. And just, it's really important to look at the period before. Daniel Smale has a quote. He said, "Historians need to develop the habit of looking backward to see how their own period is in dialogue with what came before." It seems it seems so funny to tell historians to look backwards.
Yeah.
But there is a lot of problems with the way history is studied, and again, the way history is relayed, because historians are storytellers, right?
Yeah.
Like, you can make them seem as stuffy and as scientific and nerdy and, you know, kind of cold and removed. But what you and I love about history is how alive it is. And we love the story aspect and the narrative behind it. The way people study history determines the way they tell history. And the way we are told history determines how we move forward. The whole thing of we're doomed to repeat history. Well, tell it correctly and maybe we won't do it.
Yeah.
And it's called deep history.
Well, it started with a dinosaur and a giggle. much like the planet. No, that's not true at all.
The big giggle. Can we change the big
giggle.
bang to the big giggle?
I'm fascinated by this. I also would like to say, for the record, if you wanted to do a story on dinosaurs, I would be like, yeah, that's history.
Oh, I'm 100% doing one. I just, after the big bang always comes a giggle, and I must follow the giggle.
It says a lot about you in the bedroom. What's interesting is that we're very familiar with the word prehistoric, but I guess I never really read or think of the word prehistory. And that's stupid. That's just something like, that's linguistically something we don't encounter all the time.
But yeah, and I never thought about it till I read that, where it's history is the study of the past, but the study of the past stops at the advent of language, and everything before that is before history.
Yeah.
It's just like, and I think it's also kind of you could kind of draw comparisons to how literally just naming it deep history and they're trying to take away the term prehistoric, because it gives connotations of like, this doesn't really matter, we're going to start here, or anything that happened before this point does not inform anything after it. And that's just not true. It's like how history is Eurocentric. It's based on a Judeo-Christian time frame of AD, Anno Domini, and BC, before Christ, all that stuff.
Well, and they're shifting more away from that into CE and BCE.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is what, current era or common era?
It's before the common era and the common era. So BCE is before common era, CE is common era.
But it's like, you don't see that.
No, and because
I almost never, only when I'm researching for this podcast, when I'm reading a good historical source, do I see somebody use common era and before common era instead of AD and BC.
I don't know if you noticed, but I've tried to use it since we started the podcast, because it's something that I was aware of a while ago. I went to Catholic school, and I remember the first time I heard BCE and CE, I was like, that's so dumb. It's BC and AD. Like, not really realizing how I mean, going to a Catholic school is just normal for me. It's ingrained. It's like, why is it such a big deal if we say before Christ and Anno Domini and like, but it does make a difference because it places every time span on when Judeo-Christian white people, on our timeline. Your history is based on our timeline. It's a big deal. Also, not only does that, politicize it or make it very, Christian and like, Eurocentric and all that stuff, but it takes the context out of things. It's so hard to contextualize things when what if we're talking about something that is not related to, BC, AD, all that kind of stuff. It's really hard to keep that in your mind of these things are connected, but they're not. I don't know. It's fucking weird.
Well, and I didn't go to Catholic school. I went to public school all the way through, and the only times I remember hearing BCE and CE were in science classrooms.
Oh yeah, science in Catholic school was real interesting.
But that's just, I don't know. I feel like it's like, this analogy doesn't work at all, but I was going to say, I feel like it's like how everyone in the Midwest knows, not the whole Midwest, I guess, this is in Central Time, but we know we're in Central Time.
Yes.
But rarely does people know if they're technically in CST or CDT.
Yes. Which
and
I
so
didn't
that's
even
why
know
everyone
was a
will just be like CT because it's hard to keep track of which one we're in because we're idiots.
Or like honestly, the best like example is probably the fucking metric system. Like everyone's using the metric system. It makes sense to just have one uniform system of measurement. But we're all over here and like, nah. We like Fahrenheit. We don't want to change. And so we're going to make everyone flip to the back of their notebooks to see if they have a conversion chart because we don't want to change.
Yeah.
Remember
I mean, say what you want about Celsius versus Fahrenheit. But 69 degrees Fahrenheit is like the perfect weather. And I feel like that's great that because they just made that. They were like, that's 69 Fahrenheit.
Talk about a bang and a giggle.
Yeah.
That sounds like a really bad pickup line. It's like, hey, want to go for a bang and a giggle? Or it sounds like
it's a drink. It sounds like
sex on the beach.
British breakfast.
I was just gonna say it sounds like a
British
meal, like bangers and mash. Oh yeah, I'll have a bang and a giggle.
Well, because there's a dish called Giggle and Squeak.
That's right. No, it's Bubble and Squeak.
Bubble and Squeak.
Which is the most ridiculous name.
I just wish it was Giggle and Squeak.
The only reason I know that is because Vanity Fair, hashtag sponsor maybe, has the best kind of like short like interview, like funny little videos series.
And they do like the slang or British words. Yeah, British
so
actors.
They had one with Florence Pugh, who I just love, and it's her, and she's in this like gorgeous, kind of couture dress in this beautiful kind of ornate setting, and they have basically the video is her eating all these traditional British food items that kind of have funny names, or maybe we would not have known if you're not British. But most British food is very like hearty, very kind of like, not super fancy. And she's in this gorgeous couture outfit, and you can see like a waiter with like
eating a pasty.
Yes, a waiter with like a white glove setting down, and then like every time she finishes a meal, they don't lift it, so they leave it on the table, so she just ends up having like 100 shitty foods around her. And she talks about Bubble and Squeak. And
Bubble and Squeak is like it's a traditional British breakfast dish made from potatoes and cabbage, and I think it also involves gravy. It's not a very
I thought it was like the origin of it is like it's at the end of the week and all your veggies are about to go bad, so you throw them all in it's like a garbage casserole essentially.
Yeah.
Throw everything in here before it goes bad.
Bubble and Squeak is a much better name than like garbage omelet or garbage. Why are Americans so keen to describe their food as garbage or trash?
There's a
Trash can nachos from Guy Fieri.
There's a barbecue place in Des Moines called Famous Days, which I love. It's actually very good, but they've got
it's a chain.
Yeah. I don't know. I just don't want to trash anything Des Moines, you know, like my heart. I have not been there since I was a small child, but I remember I loved their appetizer sampler and I wanted to get it every time because it was called the trash can sampler. And they literally had like a metal trash can lid that they would put, you know, like a little piece of paper, and they would put the whole sampler on there, but it came out on a trash can lid. And like people love that. They think that's endearing. It's like, we're eating out of the trash. It's quaint. Come on.
For our fans abroad, if you're
Still
abroad
listening.
in the UK, good riddance to us, right? Like, you're welcome. We took ourselves out of that equation.
It was like that kid you didn't gain custody of, and now you're kind of like, it was for the best.
Dodged a bullet. Hey, Cass.
Yes, Nat?
Would you say you wear your love of Iowa on your sleeve?
You know what? I would actually.
Is it because you regularly shop at Raygun?
Oh, you mean the greatest store in the universe? The most important clothing store the earth has ever seen since the early Mesozoic era? The one that started in Iowa and now has stores throughout the Midwest?
Mm-hmm. That's the one.
Yeah, I do own a lot of Raygun products, specifically ones that brag about Iowa. So yeah, I guess I literally wear my love of Iowa on my sleeve.
Cool. Just checking. Did you know that this podcast is sponsored by Raygun and that Raygun has stores in Des Moines, Chicago, Cedar Rapids,
Iowa City, Kansas City, Omaha, or you can shop online at raygunsite.com? Yes. Yes, I know all of that.
Of course you do.
Use promo code SHAREYOULATER to save on your next order.
You don't need to be obsessed with Iowa to shop there and enjoy their stuff.
But it never hurts.
That's raygunsite.com. Promo code SHAREYOULATER.
Hey Nat, what you been up to during the pandemic?
Oh, God. Eating, mostly.
Oh, like cooking and eating homemade meals and stuff?
No, like ordering delicious sweet treats and cakes from ECBG Cake Studio. They make specialty cakes for all occasions. They make wedding cakes, they do custom cookies, they have all sorts of sweet treats you can order and pick up.
Don't they also do online baking classes?
They do. So I guess I could get more hands-on with my baked good habit.
While Natalie stops salivating, you should go visit at ECBG_studio on Instagram and their website, ecbgstudio.com.
Well, this is great because, since we're really focusing on deep, not current history, I'm going to take us to the 1980s.
Horde left.
Yeah, the 1980s.
You would be
in
sitting
America, no less.
in the majority of where historians live.
Yeah, boy. Because I want to talk about the Deaf President Now movement. Have you ever heard of it?
I have not.
Great. Do you know about Gallaudet University?
I do not.
Great. That's fine. I'm going to tell you.
This is why I'm here.
That's why you're
share
here.
history.
Gallaudet University is a deaf university. It's a private university. It was established in 1864. It's located in Washington, D.C. Former names include the Columbia Institution for the Deaf and the Dumb, National Deaf Mute College, Columbia Institution for the Deaf. Its current name honors Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet, who his wife was deaf, and he, I think, was an educator, and he just became aware of the lack of proper education for deaf children. So he travels to Europe to try and see if they're, doing better at it than we are. He's unimpressed with England, which I'm like, I don't know why that made me chuckle. But it's because in England, deaf schooling, they didn't use sign language.
What do they use?
There's two schools of thought when it comes to the education of the deaf and the hard of hearing community, and that is the manual school of thought, which is sign language, and the oral school of thought. so they were teaching them like orally,
like lip reading and everything.
Yeah, basically, I think is what it is.
Also, I feel bad now that your topic didn't go first because it would have worked perfect with our charity plug today.
That's fine. We can. We're bringing it back. We're bringing it home.
Circle.
Don't you dare! Don't you dare sing "Bring Him Home."
Oh,
yeah.
I didn't even think about it, and now I have.
Nope. No, you don't. Nope. We just lost like 20 listeners.
I'm so angry that I didn't think of it.
I hate you. I love you so much.
I love you so much.
Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet goes to London, is like, y'all suck too. Then goes to Paris. He goes to the Paris School for the Deaf, and they used a lot of sign language.
Wait, so this is in the 80s? The 1980s?
This is the 1860s.
Oh,
This
okay.
is the guy who the school is named after. I'm just giving you
got it.
context around the school.
All right.
Because we're gonna be living at that school. So he goes to Paris. He gets some pointers from them, and one of their educators comes with him back to the U.S. to establish the American School for the Deaf in 1817 in Hartford, Connecticut. So that's who Gallaudet University is named for. Mm-hmm. Because when they were established initially as a grammar school, the first superintendent of the school was Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet's son, Edward Minor Gallaudet. So that's where the namesake is. There's a statue of him, just so that you know. So it started in 1857, and it started as a grammar school and became a college in 1864. Blah, 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 blah. Fast forward to...
Yeah. Sorry, I just got very hard Peanut vibes.
Oh, what's interesting, because my first question was, can hearing people go to it because it's a deaf university? And yes, if you were wondering, they have graduate programs and undergraduate programs, and they do admit hearing individuals. I think it is more selective and difficult to be a hearing student in the graduate programs, but fun facts.
Well, is that... Because I know, there are many people who can hear who study sign language or, that kind of thing. Do you have to be studying that thing specifically? Or is it just like, I am a really good student and want to go to the school for the deaf and hard of hearing, so I'm going to go?
No, you don't have to be studying it. However, it is, it was the first and I think only place of higher learning that is designed specifically for the hard of hearing and deaf community.
Yeah.
So all of the instruction and everything
yeah.
is tailored to that.
Right.
Versus...
I just think that's cool that, like, you should totally go to a school that you want to go to, and because they're specifically for deaf or hard of hearing, you don't need to be studying that as a, like, oh, I'm studying you guys, so I'm going to come to your school. I think that's cool to be like, just come to our school.
Yeah. It's
don't other us.
Unlike now I'm going to other universities. Unlike the bulk of colleges and universities where it is very difficult to, it's more challenging to be a deaf student because you don't necessarily have interpreters. It's a special...
No one places emphasis on it.
Yeah. It's an additional thing that you require to study there. The school is just designed to be inclusive and directed towards a learning style that suits the deaf and hard of hearing. So cool. Fast forward to 1988. Gallaudet uses and emphasizes sign language and the manual, and so they're of the manual school. So why are they like the epicenter of a major deaf rights movement? Because I guess before we get to 1988, a little bit of context, since I mentioned that there's these major disagreements among educators of whether of the manualist and the oralist techniques.
And I love context.
Yes, and I know we just talked about, the first topic was about historical context, so I would be remiss if I didn't. In 1880, an international meeting of educators of deaf children in Milan banned the use of sign language in the teaching of deaf children. And as a result, many deaf teachers were fired. So then most of the teachers and administrators in institutions designed to educate deaf children were hearing. So your teachers were hearing people. Gallaudet University continued to use sign language. That was their bread and butter. That was the teaching theory that they were based out of.
Yeah.
But by 1919, almost all schools for deaf children used the oral method of instruction exclusively, and most of the teachers were hearing. At Gallaudet, despite the fact that they used sign language, from 1864, when they became a college, to 1983, they had 4 presidents, all with a background in education of deaf students, one with a deaf mother and one with a deaf spouse, but all of them were hearing. Yeah. So we're at we've gone through 4. We're at the 80s. We've had 4 presidents of the university. They've all been hearing individuals. So during 1983, while they were searching for their 5th president, several folks in the deaf community started to voice their advocacy and support, saying hey, it'd be nice if we could have a deaf president of this deaf university.
Yeah.
We'd like that.
Checks out.
Right? They even formed a council. The university formed a council as a President's Council on Deafness, or PCD, and it was a group of deaf staff and faculty that were concerned that the needs of deaf students were not being well served by the Board of Trustees and by the president of the university because they were a hearing person. But it didn't catch on, and another hearing man was hired for that job. But he was only there for a few months.
Of course, he was a man.
Yeah. Well,
Sorry,
also, I should mention that from 1864 to 1983, all 4 of those presidents were also men.
Yeah. Not surprised.
Yeah. So they named Dr. Jerry C. Lee as the 6th president. 5th? No. Yeah, they named Dr. Edward C. Merrill Jr. as the... Nope. My notes are a mess.
Oh, that was such a creepy laugh.
Just giggling while I can't find my notes. So the 5th president was a hearing dude, and then the 6th president, who took over for him initially as an interim president, and then he was president for a couple of years, they didn't do a big interview process for him because he was just kind of tapped as an interim, and then they were like, you're already doing the job, you can stick around and be president. He was a hearing gentleman. So I guess also now we're at 6 presidents, and they're all dudes too. But in 1987, the 6th president, Dr. Jerry C. Lee, announced his resignation, and more questionable and problematic to a lot of people is he was leaving the position to take a VP position at a furniture company that was run by the husband of the woman who was the chair of the board of trustees. Her name is Jane Spillman, and people were kind of like, I don't like that basically your husband is poaching the president of this college that you're on the board of, so clearly you probably had a hand in this, but that's neither here nor there.
Feels icky. Yeah.
It just feels icky. It's just gross.
Nah.
But it's not about him because he resigned and took this job. It is, a lot of it, about the chair of the board of trustees, Jane Spillman, because they established a committee of board members and alumni and students and faculty and staff and yada yada to start searching for the next president, the 7th president of Gallaudet University. They hired a consultant to ensure that the best deaf and hearing candidates applied and got a fair shake. And in January of 1988, It took me a minute to remember what year we were in. They were like, yo, we got 6 finalists or semi-finalists for this job. 3 of them are deaf. 3 of them are hearing. Let's give ourselves a pat on the back. We're doing so great. And then they reduced it down to 3. And of those 3, 2 were deaf. 1 was hearing. Those finalists were Dr. Harvey Corson, a deaf man and superintendent of the Louisiana School for the Deaf. Dr. I. King Jordan, a deaf man, currently the dean of Gallaudet's College of Arts and Sciences, so an internal hire. And Dr. Elizabeth Zinser, a hearing woman and assistant chancellor of University of North Carolina at Greensboro. So, I mean, pat on the back, you got a woman on there.
Yeah.
But she's also the only hearing candidate. So
Ain't that
now,
the way?
deaf advocacy groups and organizations have made it pretty clear over the last, year that they want the next president to be deaf.
Yeah.
And this time it actually gained widespread support, a little bit of press, but mostly just widespread support in the deaf community. Mm-hmm. There were articles and there were letter writing campaigns, and people were recommending lists of potential deaf candidates who are qualified. The then vice president, George Bush, endorsed the call for a deaf president, as did Jesse Jackson, as did several senators, including Bob Dole, who you can't not mention Bob Dole when he comes up.
I just always think of him holding a pencil in his hand. When Bob Dole became, he was there was a lot of Bob Dole stuff going on in the 90s. He was running for president, or he was a VP or something, running as VP. I just remember, some of my first memories of SNL and not
Bob Dole.
Well, and not realizing they were due to a lot of political stuff. Some of the early political stuff that I remember was someone doing an impression of Bob Dole and just holding a pencil in his hand, and me thinking that was so funny, and then realizing he had he had some sort of medical whatever that he couldn't move his hand, so they would just put something in it so it didn't look like it was awkwardly hanging out.
Bob Dole.
Guys.
It's Norm Macdonald did Bob
Norm,
Dole on SNL.
Yeah. I just remember the pencil. That's all I think of whenever I see Bob Dole. It's a pencil. It's horrible.
But even Bob Dole is maybe a deaf president for this deaf university. The media and the student body of Gallaudet wasn't really involved yet. It was mostly deaf advocacy groups and alumni.
The student body was not.
They just weren't politically charged up in part of it yet. They just were the university will do the right thing. It's fine.
Okay.
I don't know. Presumably. So March 1st, 1988. I'm telling you the date because we're only gonna be. This story takes place over the course of 8 days. Mm-hmm. So March 1st to March. What is math? Nope,
88?
sorry. The story takes. It's more than 8 days. I think I'm wrong.
This was almost a month after my sister was born.
Very important.
So
in 1988.
Knows. Yeah, February 18th, 1988. So about half a month. Happy birthday, Kate.
Kate was a fresh baby.
She's an Aquarius baby.
A fresh Aquarius baby.
And baby.
A baby. So March 1st, 1988, the first fully organized rally attracts more than 1,000 university students, elementary and high school students from the university's other programs, staff, faculty, alumni, and other members of the local deaf community. They march from the football field all around campus. They end at Gallaudet's statue. There's speeches. It's great. Mm-hmm. Over the next 4 days, they camped out on the president's lawn, being yo, give us a deaf president.
Right.
The president of the student body wrote Dr. Zinser, the only hearing candidate, and politely suggested she should withdraw her candidacy since the student body wanted a deaf president. She was the only remaining hearing candidate.
Yeah.
A television reporter and crew arrive on the campus sometime in this period. And so that brings us to March 5th, 1988, when the Board of Trustees was meeting at the Mayflower Hotel downtown to conduct the final interviews of their 3 finalists. And they had said that they were going to announce the decision on campus at 8 p.m. the next day. Mm-hmm. At 6:30 p.m. the next day, they just kind of hastily hand out a press release to the press that was kind of waiting at the hotel, announcing that their choice was Dr. Elizabeth Zinser, the only hearing candidate.
Ooh.
Everybody's like, hell no. The crowd that had gathered at the school waiting for the formal announcement at 8 finds out what has been announced, and they're like, screw it, let's march. So they start walking. They spill out onto, like, in the front of campus. They start blocking traffic. Somebody suggests that they march to the Mayflower Hotel, where the board still is. They're like, all right, let's go and let's demand an explanation. Mm-hmm. They get there. They demand said explanation. They demand like a meeting with the board to be like, what are you thinking? And it is said that allegedly, I'm going to say allegedly because she denies it adamantly. Allegedly, during this meeting, the board chair, Jane Spillman, stated that, quote, deaf people are not able to function in a hearing world.
Wait, Janie said this?
Yes, allegedly.
Oh, Jay. Oh, no. Oh, baby.
After this meeting, which lasted several hours, she expresses a desire to speak and explain to the crowd that has gathered why Zinser was selected. Mm-hmm. It does not go well.
Oh, no. Because you know what I want to hear? Me as a deaf and or hard of hearing person, that, oh, you were chosen because I'm not able to function. Like, wait, what was the quote she said? Not able
that deaf people are not able to function in a hearing world.
Fuck you. I need someone who is going to make the hearing world function for me.
Yeah.
Fuck. Oh.
Yep.
I feel icky now.
She's seen as dismissive, surprise, surprise, and out of touch with deaf people, which was something that had been being talked about a lot about the board, kind of since like 2 presidents ago, that they just were like, I don't know that this board of trustees of all hearing people is really in touch with deaf people and our needs and our community. This doesn't go well, but she still agrees to come to campus the next day to discuss things further. Mm-hmm. She presumably goes home and goes to bed. The march continues to the White House, to the Capitol building, and then back to campus. The students and the protesters are like up all night debating and discussing and determining what their demands are. So the next day, they drive their cars, they drive a bunch of cars, and they block all of the university's entrances, and they deflate the tires so that they're blocking entrances so people can't get in and out. They form a human chain to block some of the administrators. There are speeches, there are rallies. They formalize their demands. Here are their demands. They have a meeting at noon with Spillman, and they voice these. 1, Dr. Zinser must resign, and a deaf president be selected. 2, Spillman must resign from the board. 3, the percentage of deaf members on the board of trustees must be increased to at least 51%. I guess I misspoke when I said that the board was all hearing. It wasn't.
Yeah.
But it wasn't balanced in this way. So at least 51% of the board must be deaf. And then their 4th demand, there must be no reprisals against any of the protesters. So this meeting with Spillman lasts a couple of hours. The board, at the end of it, the board just goes, no. And they just reject the demands. And they proceed to the...
Wait, they just flat out say no?
Yeah, they like discuss them. But then at the end, they're like, no, we're not giving you any of these things. Which they seem like very reasonable demands.
Yeah.
At least there not being any reprisals against the protesters. Like, if you're not even agreeing to that demand, you're just throwing gasoline on the fire.
I feel like even if you want to do the whole thing of like, we're not going to give you what you want, but we're going to at least pretend like we're trying, doesn't even sound like
not at all.
At least fake it. I mean,
well,
don't.
And then
but,
on
like,
top of it, there's a series of like really interesting moves where they keep trying to announce things or having press conferences and stuff. And I'm just like, oh
stop.
boy.
Just stop.
So they have this like 3-hour meeting during which they refuse to compromise to any extent. And then at the end of it, once they've said like, no, they pat themselves on the back and head to the auditorium to announce what has not been agreed to, like to just make announcements. But so Spillman walks up to like make this announcement, and she gets Kanye'd by a deaf faculty member.
By actual Kanye.
Yeah, Kanye shows up. No, a deaf faculty member comes out in front of her and tells everyone that their demands have not been met, and so there's no use in staying at this like announcement meeting or whatever. So everyone walks out and continues marching, and they march to the Capitol and they demonstrate there again. At this point, this is now March 7th. They are front page news. So now they're like really going. So now they have the media behind them too. March 8th, the students are boycotting classes. Faculty is like, can we support the students? Like, what should we be doing? Should we just do things behind the scenes? There's rallies, there's speeches. 4 students at this point emerge as the leaders of the protests. That's Brigetta Bourne, Jerry Koval, Greg Hlybach, and Tim Raris. They're like getting super well coordinated at this point. March 9th, Dr. Zinsser arrives in DC to start her presidency early. She's agreed to do that. She wasn't supposed to start until later. But the hopes were that her presence on campus will like just bring the protest to a close.
Let me guess. That didn't work.
It did not. But they also tried having, I don't know much about the third candidate, but on paper, from what I know, the limited amount I know, possibly the most qualified candidate, because he was already like the dean or the VP of a department on campus. Dr. I. King Jordan, he's the one who's the deaf administrator at the school. She met with him, and then they together went and did like a press conference and met with the student leaders. The student leaders are like, yo, you should step down. She's like, nah. They go do a press conference so it's Zinsser and Jordan at this press conference. Jordan publicly announces his endorsement and support of Zinsser. The students and alumni and advocacy groups are still like, nah. A few board members who also are Congressmen David Bonnier and Steve Gunderson, had met with a small contingency of the students, during which that meeting, clearly the students made their case, because later that day, the congressman urged Dr. Zinsser to resign and to not accept the position.
Yeah.
One of the congressmen even publicly endorses and voices his support for the protesters and the faculty and staff.
I feel like that's huge. I feel like people think politics are they are corrupt, they are whatever, maybe people get into them as, they want to rise in their career, or sometimes I think people, they do believe, they're like, I want to do good and I want to help people. And because of the machine of politics, you lose that, or if you do try to remain pure, you're not going to get anywhere. So I feel like when you've reached that level of someone's in Congress and you're appealing to them, maybe this is just the cynic in me, but if you change their minds, it's usually because they're thinking about public perception, re-election. Is this going to give me backlash? I feel like not very often do you genuinely change someone in politics' minds because of like, this is the right thing to do. Which again, it seems very cynical, but like, that's also, you've got everything going against you when you're like, this is the right thing to do. This is not the popular thing to do, but I need this from you and we need this from you. I feel like that's huge to get several congressmen and be like, we need this. And they're like, you're right. We are on the protesters' side now.
And not even that. These two congressmen are members of the board who chose Dr. Zinser.
Yeah.
And so I'm assuming that there was a vote and that they voted for Dr. Zinser, but
Yeah.
they're actually changing their mind. It's not that they were just kind of hanging out doing whatever and then were told about this and had a productive discussion about it. They they actively voted against it initially.
And there's so many parallels till nowadays with politics now and people who are so adamantly, like, this is my party or this is my choice or this is what I'm supposed to vote for and I voted for it and I may believe the other way after all of this backlash, but I can't change it. And, seeing a lot of people from one side of the aisle actively changing their mind and choosing to do the thing that they believe, even though you'd expect them to be like, well, I'm supposed to say this thing, or I'm only doing this because of backlash, or I feel like we're seeing that a lot now where people on, I don't want to say it, but the Republican side of the aisle who generally go, and everyone does this, but they're going for party decision, and they're really pushing their bounds with it, and now they're finally being like, nope, this is the right thing to do, and I'm going to switch sides.
Yeah.
It resonates very heavily. Like, that is a huge thing to see for someone to
and
just
for
genuinely
anyone that's
see
hearing
the other
this
side.
and being like, why are they getting political? History's political. Deal with it. It is. It is, especially the way we learn it.
And the way we relay it.
Yep. So this congressman publicly announces his support for the protesters. The faculty and staff have a vote and decide to publicly announce their support for the student-led protest. There's more supporters flocking to the campus all the time. One of the student leaders and Zinser and deaf actress Marley Matlin are interviewed by Ted Koppel at Nightline, so they get in that good press. One of them is
God
on
bless
Good
Ted
Morning
Koppel.
America the next day. Gotta love Ted Koppel. Students suspect that Zinser and Spillman are going to force their way on campus, so they block the gates again, this time with school buses with deflated tires, which is just a fun little anecdote that I'm loving this. There's more rallies. So now we're on day 5. So now we're March 10th. There's more rallies, more arrivals of supporters, more endorsements, more monetary support, more supply support. King Jordan retracts his support that he gave at that press conference for the board's decision to support Zinser, and instead voices his support for the students and protesters and all of their demands. So, yeah, so he stops being like that little pawn, basically, for the board of trustees. He, too, is like, you know what? I retract that. Now we're on day 6, March 11th. Oh, on day 5, on March 10th, at the end of the day, Zinser announces her resignation. I love that gasp. It was beautiful.
That's all I got.
The next day, though, the students are like, don't celebrate too soon. We still have 3.5 demands to go, because our first demand was that Zinser should resign and that you should support, or that the Board of Trustees should hire a deaf president.
Yes.
So that's only half of one of their demands met. So they wear buttons that say 3.5 on them.
Oh, I love that. Mm-hmm. That's so shady, and I love it.
They're like, not quite. They stay on the students stay on campus instead of leave for spring break, which is starting like the next day, I think, or that day. They continue to protest. They staged a big protest that was, never mind. That's fine. This whole thing is a big protest. There's another march to the Capitol. This one scheduled in advance with permits and everything. All the other ones had been impromptu. There's another rally. So now day 7. You know what they did on the 7th day, Cass?
Did they rest?
They did.
Did they really?
They did.
Oh,
it was
man.
apparently just like a really nice day for March. And so the students, they kicked back. They had barbecues. And
We've been working hard. We need a break.
yeah, they had all-day art fests. They were still celebrating each other and themselves. They just were like, we'll hang out for a bit. The next day, the board of trustee members who had gone home after the announcement of hiring Zinser returned to Washington for an emergency meeting to figure out what the heck to do next. Mm-hmm. It took them 8 days to return to figure this out. And finally, in the evening, Phil Braven and Jane Spillman hosted one final press conference to state that Spillman had resigned. Braven was named the next chair of the Board of Trustees. So that's another one of the demands of theirs, was that Spillman resign. So we got 1.5 demands met. Mm-hmm. A task force would be set up to determine the best way to achieve the 51% deaf majority of the board. So that is at least a step towards now 2.5 demands met. There would be no reprisals on the protesters. So now we're actually at 3.5 instead of having 3.5 left to go. And Dr. I. King Jordan was named the 8th president and first deaf president of Gallaudet University.
You know what, Nat? I don't do math at all, so the numbers were confusing me, but he got it in the end. And I understood it. Thank you for breaking that math down.
You are so welcome. So that's all 4 of their demands met. And this...
Also, way to hold out till you get all of them, right?
Yeah, right?
No compromise.
I mean, coming out of that first meeting with Janie, they weren't going to compromise.
None
compromise. So that's the story of the Deaf President Now movement, which is its legacy is that it was this was monumental, and it catalyzed efforts to pass the Americans with Disabilities Act, and just was a beautiful moment.
That's so cool. I feel like disability activism is seemingly such a new kind of phenomenon. We don't talk about it I feel like maybe the 70s, even then, probably not even then, the 80s are when we start talking about disabilities acts and, marches and all that stuff. And it is such a tumultuous part of American history.
Well, and we still have such a long way to go.
Yes. It is also it feels niche. It feels like, it feels very footnote-y. This is an interesting thing. Oh, this is different from what we usually study.
I feel like the only things we ever learn about it are the major milestones, which to me feel very much like, let's just study the moments that we can pat ourselves on the back.
Yes.
The moment that we actually did something.
Yeah. It really just does feel like a footnote that I learned in school. Whoa.
Well, just like we kind of learn the way that the civil rights movement is taught is very much the civil rights movement happened and we solved racism and racism ended. And it's equally easy though, and I feel like it happens a lot, that all civil rights issues are lumped into that chapter that you learn about, that you're specifically learning about desegregation and those civil rights.
Yeah.
The American with Disabilities Act didn't pass until 1990. It was signed into law in 1990. I had never heard about the Deaf President Now movement until I followed Nile Demarco on Instagram.
Who's Nile Demarco?
He's a very handsome man. He's a model and an actor, and he won Cycle 22 of America's Next Top Model.
Ooh!
And he is deaf. And I heard about it because he posted the other day that they are, a studio announced that they're going to be producing a real life drama set at Gallaudet based on the events of the Deaf President Now movement. It's specifically based on the way it's told in the book Deaf President Now, the 1988 Revolution at Gallaudet University by John B. Christensen and Sharon N. Barnett. That is about the week of the protests. And so I heard about this because they had announced that they were going to work on the project, and he had posted about it. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting. I have never learned about that.
Deaf West, which is a Broadway company in New York, their production...
Did they do the production of Spring Awakening? Is that what you're going to talk about?
That's exactly what I'm going to talk about.
Oh my God.
So, Spring Awakening is my favorite musical of all time, which is huge because Oklahoma is my favorite musical of all time. Spring Awakening is my favorite musical. There's no way you could top it. The original Broadway cast, there's no way you can top any production, any number that they ever did. And then Deaf West decided to do Spring Awakening. They did a reproduction of it. And it went to the Tonys. I think they had to get people to pay so that they could just perform on stage. And I saw their performance on Seth Meyers. And in my mind, I'm so like, no, you can't beat Spring Awakening. You cannot beat the original production. It's so moving. It's so important to me. And I saw their production of Touch Me on Seth Meyers, which is my favorite song. I used to gig with it at bars. And I was like, oh, fuck. They blew them out of the water.
It's so good.
And it's not because they're, it's not the kind of, I hate using this word, but like novelty of a deaf production or anything. It's just better because there's so much more depth involved in it and complexity. And especially because a lot of the play is about communication between adolescents not knowing how to express themselves, between the communication between youths and adults and whatnot, between deaf and hearing. There's so much added layers to it, and there's also that attention and that respect of we don't all communicate the same way, whether it's sign language, whether it's hearing. It's so beautiful. And
it's just like also from a production perspective, just even from a theatrical production and attention to detail and design perspective.
Yeah.
Magnificent.
You kind of have to completely rethink the way you connect to an audience. Mm-hmm. How do we let every single person in the audience, deaf, hearing, hard of hearing, be able to watch and see the same show? You have to think of it from 3 different points of view and then figure out how to make it all unified. And it just puts that extra level of care and intention and integrity to everything that I just really respect.
If you're listening to this and you're confused as to how they did a musical, they had it double cast. So the performers on stage in the roles were deaf performers or disabled performers who were signed and who were signing, and the singing talent were other actors. Not every role was like that, because I know Ali Stroker
who won the fucking Tony for Oklahoma.
Yeah, that performance is amazing too.
I'm trying to figure out one of the actors who was in Spring Awakening, and I'm trying to figure out his name. Joshua Castile. He was in Spring Awakening. I don't remember what part he played, but they actually ended up doing The Hunchback of Notre Dame, which was a Broadway musical, which didn't do super well, but they did a production of it, and the level of intensity and care and he is in it. It's otherworldly. It's phenomenal, and I dare you to watch it and not cry.
I would not succeed at that dare because I have already watched it and cried.
When I first found out about Deaf West doing Spring Awakening production, I became obsessed, and I just started researching them, and specifically within the acting community, Deaf West is doing amazing things, and I'm constantly impressed with how they can reach out to the deaf community, but also reach out to the hearing community. And not in the sense of making it hearing accessible, You know, it's like, oh, this is a deaf show, but we'll make it able so people can hear it or understand it. But the way they approach it is
that it's not a binary.
It's not a binary. It's come into this world. We're both in here. We're asking you to make some leaps because the deaf and the hard of hearing community has always had to adapt to a hearing community. You know, they don't make it like attacking, but they also are like, meet us on our level.
Well, and there's that actually ties things up nicely in a nice little bow for me, because there's a quote that I had copied down from an article in Pacific Standard, I think, where one of the students who was there for the protests was reflecting on, this is 2 years ago, the 30th anniversary of the protests, and they said about the legacy, Deaf President Now was about showing the world that we can. Since then, we lived with the determination that we will. The student also said that they still see too much binary thinking, the idea that children must be raised with either a visual or spoken language, rather than trying to understand how sign language and spoken language work together.
You mentioned Marley Matlin earlier, was one of the she was supporting the protest. Marley Matlin is the first deaf Academy Award winner for Children of a Lesser God, which was based off of a play which was written specifically for a deaf actress. And the story of the play and of the actress that this was loosely based around is she went to a deaf school. She had a teacher who was able to hear, and he was kind of pushing her to use her voice, and she wouldn't do it. Kind of like combative, why do I need to change for you, for this different community? Why aren't you addressing and changing for me and whatnot? Marley Matlin acted in the film. She won an Oscar for it. She went on to have a wonderful stage and film and television career. She was in the Deaf West production of Spring Awakening. It's a really cool part of American history that no one talks about, and it's not history. It's still going on.
Just read that note that it's still going on. There were some stats in one of the articles I was reading that just one of them said that this is in 2016. Less than 40% of people who are deaf or hard of hearing in the United States were employed full time in 2016, according to Cornell University's Institute on Employment and Disability. And I don't remember the stat exactly, but I think it was about 70% of those who were employed were underemployed. And they had done studies where basically it's harder to get a job because it's another consideration for the employer to adapt or to be inclusive, to create an environment in which you can do the job that you are qualified for. And not only getting the job, but just there was some stat that was the percentage likelihood of like not getting the interview or something like that if you requested an interpreter.
Yeah. All because we don't want to have to change our orders and operations a little bit and learn something new. That's lazy.
Yeah, so I was interested in that story. I took sign language in summer school. I don't remember most of it. I wanted to take it as my foreign language in college, and then I transferred universities and no longer had a foreign language requirement, and so I didn't. But it's a really interesting and cool language, and so much of it is the actual, like, the expression of it. It's really, I should start. I still have like my book from that class. I should dig back in. But that's my story.
Man, what a great story. I feel like this is another example of our tap dancing episode where you did not realize this is a weird secret obsession of mine.
I was tapping into something you're really into. Yep.
Tapping in. Yes. As soon as you said, that this was the deaf and hard of hearing community, my mind immediately went to Deaf West, and I was like, oh no.
Cool. So that entire story
I'm gonna talk
Cass
about,
was sitting there.
I'm going to talk about deaf musical theater, and the whole time.
Oh, and just because I just thought of it, the irony of telling a story about the deaf community on an auditory platform is not lost on me. Most of the deaf community knows this story, but in general, it's very slow going. But it is something that since day one has been an important thing to us to get transcripts of our episodes up. So we'll link to where those are living now, because they might move in the bio of this episode that we're trying to get transcripts.
It's hard to find transcription services that are A, not crazy expensive, B, user-friendly, C, not completely tedious and tedium, whatnot.
Yeah. Let me put this out there, listeners. If you donate to our Patreon, so Arcade Audio has a umbrella Patreon, and the amount that it raises is divvied up amongst the podcasts. You get a chance when you support it to say that you listen to us. I'm a say it right now. If you donate to our Patreon and support our Patreon, that is the next kind of expense goal, is to be able to, we have someone helping out with transcripts. We've done some of them ourselves. It's very slow going at the moment. But I would love to be able to compensate people who are helping us or pay for a transcription service. So if you support our Patreon, this is me promising to put some of that money or all of that money towards getting those transcriptions up there so that the deaf and hard of hearing community have those available and can enjoy the podcast as much as you do. So that's patreon.com/arcadeaudio. And if you want to see any beautiful pictures of anything that we talked about, there's always visual aids over at @sharedpod on Instagram and the Twitter.
If y'all have a specific topic that you want us to cover, throw us or shoot us an email at sharedhistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can also email us if we got anything wrong and you got some questions, corrections, or suggestions. Or if you just want to say, hey, you know what? We're in a pandemic and we'd love to chat.
Maybe if you listen to the podcast on a platform that doesn't let you leave a review, send it to us in an email.
Oh,
we might still send you a button.
And we can feature you on Fan Friday.
Yeah.
And on that note, share you later.
Thank you for playing Arcade Audio. Play more at arcadeaudio.net.